From Built It Productions, it's The Great Creators. Conversations about creativity with some of the most celebrated actors, musicians, and performers of our time. I'm Guy Raz, and on the show today, Seth Meyers, from head writer on SNL to hosting his own late-night show on NBC.
It's crazy, man. I've worked in the same building for over 20 years. I have the same ID that I took when August 20th, 2001. I look the same. It's really shocking. Absolutely just unchanged.
Seth Meyers joined Saturday Night Live in 2001, and it was an era that brought together a legendary group of actors who would go on to redefine American comedy. People like Tina Fey, Amy Poehler, Kenan Thompson, and Fred Armisen. And in his early years on the show, Seth had a lot of anxiety about his ability to compete with other cast members. And who could blame him? I mean, imagine trying to stand out next to Andy Samberg or Kristen Wiig or Bill Hader or Maya Rudolph. Even though Seth was initially hired as an actor, he eventually realized that his biggest strength was off-screen, writing killer sketches for his fellow cast members. In this episode of The Great Creators, you'll hear how Seth first became obsessed with improv after seeing a performance in college, how his two-person comedy show in Chicago randomly landed him in front of just the right person to get him an audition at Saturday Night Live, and how, after Jimmy Fallon left late night, Seth managed to lead that show to new heights. That's all coming up after this quick break. Seth Meyers was born in Evanston, Illinois in 1973. He grew up in Michigan before moving to New Hampshire. His mom was a French teacher and his dad worked in finance. And Seth was really close with his younger brother, Josh, who would also grow up to be a comedian. And with the way everything turned out, you could argue that the most valuable trait the Meyers boys inherited from their parents was good taste in comedy.
I was really lucky. My parents, the thing I always say about my parents is they just had a great respect for comedy.
Yeah.
They met in Chicago in, early 70s and would go see Second City together on dates. They watched SNL, they watched Monty Python, and then when they had kids, one, they just liked being funny and making us laugh, and they liked laughing at things we said, and then it became a real communal experience to sit down and watch things that were professionally made that were comedy.
I was reading about some of the comedy that they exposed you to, like P.G. Wodehouse, and you mentioned Monty Python and SNL. I mean, this was the 80s we're talking about, and maybe sort of late 80s. So it wasn't like Andrew Dice Clay, not to disparage him, but that was definitely kind of more of a crass kind of humor, or like the Jerky Boys. I'm trying to think of like the kind of things that were out there at the time.
Yeah, I think I really remember Andrew Dice Clay was the thing you discovered with your high school friends, and Jerky Boys was something you discovered with your college friends. Whereas, it's funny because I think both of those things my parents would frame as crass, but my dad loved Richard Pryor. My dad loved showing us movies that were R-rated from the 70s and early 80s. So, I do think crass. What counts as crass is, of course, generational, because my dad was showing me plenty of things his parents would think were crass.
Yeah. So comedy, it was around. Like they would expose you to highbrow stuff. I mean, I hate that word highbrow because it makes it seem like it's elitist, but like they really had certain kind of comedy aesthetic that they were going for.
We did watch Monty Python when it aired on PBS, so I do think if you could ever categorize comedy as highbrow, it is, when it's introduced by someone in a, wingback chair sitting in front of a bookshelf. But, it was also SNL. It was, but again, we went on long trips. We would, go drive 4 hours to go skiing, and we always listened to books on tape. And that was a really cool thing because it was a lot of P.G. Wodehouse. It was a lot of Gene Shepard was a big thing for us. And then even Catch-22. I remember the first time I was introduced to Catch-22 was us just listening to Alan Arkin read it on these, 12 cassette boxes that my mom would bring home from the library.
When you were like a teenager, I read that you didn't take part in, like, audition for school plays. You weren't like a class clown or joker, which is fine. I mean, it doesn't obviously, portend future employment.
Yeah.
But what were you into? Like, what did you think you wanted to do?
I thought I'd be a writer. I thought it'd be something to do with writing. We had high school superlatives, and at the end of high school, there was best sense of humor and there was class clown. And I actually did win best sense of humor, which I think is the one you give to the person you think should be a writer.
Right.
Whereas, the class clown maybe has a little bit more performing chops than you do. I had a great anxiety about auditioning for things and being on stage in front of people and learning lines. But sort of late in high school, some friends, I was always very lucky to have friends who were more ambitious and had more vision than I did, who organized a comedy night, and we did it in the high school auditorium. And then all of a sudden there was this collaborative space where I could get up with a group of friends that were my own, and there was no sort of supervising adult. And we would do sort of knockoff SNL sketches where it would be soft impressions of teachers that were the kind of thing you could get away with. And that was a huge rush. But even then, when I went off to college, my plan was, I'm going to write and direct movies. And it wasn't until that I got to school, new student week, I saw the Northwestern improv troupe, Meow, get up on stage. And it was genuinely more than maybe anything I've ever felt, love at first sight.
But you were like, you weren't the kind of kid growing up watching SNL and like trying to mimic, like, obviously famously Jimmy Fallon, right? Who's been on my show. He used to do impressions like every weekend, right? And you were not like trying to, you weren't like watching it and doing that or anything.
Well, I did watch it religiously, and my brother and I would do things like Hans and Franz at school events. So I think there was a little of that. And it should be noted that when I got to SNL, I, with a great amount of ignorance, assumed that the path that everyone else was doing was going to work perfectly fine for me. And so it wasn't from a lack of trying that I didn't have a lot of impressions on the show. It was more a lack of skill and execution.
I don't know about that. We'll get to
thank you. But I did get to this show, and I think it happens to everybody who gets to SNL.
Yeah.
And I wish I had started asking around a little bit quicker when I first got there, because you assume you're the only one who feels like an imposter when you show up there. And you kind of then, because you feel like an imposter, you don't talk to anybody about it, because the last thing you want to do is be the informant who fingers yourself.
Right.
So you kind of keep it on the down low. And so I was lucky enough to, there was a producer there named Mike Shoemaker, who's currently the producer of the show. We're, 20 years into a friendship, and he sort of guided me to this path where I do a lot of writing. He sort of said, look, there's not a lot of cast members on the show who can also write the way you do. So try to write great parts for the host where you also have a very good part. And this whole thing for you is going to build slower than it builds for other people. One of the quickest ways to pop on the show is if you are, a talented impressionist and you watch people like, obviously he then grew into one of the top 5 most well-rounded cast members in the history of the show, Bill Hader. But Bill kind of threw himself onto the scene by doing impressions that blew people away. And now I don't think anybody looks back on his time and says he was an impressionist only, but it was a really helpful way to get the audience to know who you were.
So you were not, admittedly, you weren't the kid sort of jumping up on stage in high school, but when you got to college, you saw this improv troupe and you were like, I want to be that. That's what I want to do. I want to be up there. It took you a couple of years before.
It took me 3 years. Yes.
3 years.
Fortunately, for your listeners probably know this. Most universities are 4 years. Thank God. But yeah, I auditioned every year, and I only got in my senior year. It was capped at 8. I know a lot of your listeners are rolling their eyes right now because they probably went to schools with like 30, 40 person improv troupes. This was cream of the crop situation. But yeah, I didn't get in until my senior year, and that was. The other thing about improvising versus acting, which continues to be why I'm drawn to one more than the other, is it's your own show. You get to make your own choices, and you get to live or die on the way your own brain works, and you don't have to doubt that other people have done it better than you in the past.
Yeah.
And And so it was great. And a lot of my story, and I think it's probably true of a lot of creative people, is how lucky I was to interact with other creative people over the course of my life, people that were the same age as me, people that are going through the same thing. And, I'm still really close with a lot of those people that I started improvising with in Chicago. And one of the things about improvising with people in Chicago when you go to school there is you start going into the city once or twice a week, and you're either going to see this incredible generation of Chicago improvisers. For me, that's people like Rachel Dratch and Amy Poehler and Tina Fey. Or you're going to take classes and to sort of start commingling with this really cool generation of people who wanted to do the same thing that you did.
It's clear that was a turning point, right? Like being part of that troupe and presumably giving the confidence to stand up, to present, and also to kind of think quickly. And I mean, we've had conversations with so many people who've been on the show who've talked about improv as this really important turning point. And I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist, and neither are you, but there must be something about it that rewires your brain. Like that experience of being in a troupe of people who are throwing things at you and kind of pushing you to think about comedy, what you're going to say, how you're going to respond very quickly. Like, do you remember sort of going through this transition, just a sort of a mental transition?
It's a great question. I do think the most important thing is when you fashion yourself or want to be a comedy writer, the hardest part is sitting down and writing.
Yeah.
And the reality is you're totally, you're a victim to your own lack of scheduling prowess. And you oftentimes realize a week, 2 weeks have gone by and you haven't sat down and put a pen to paper. But if you're improvising, the reality is improvising is just really fast writing. And so even though you're not committing it to paper, it's just all this rough drafting, which is how you learn to be a better writer. And, getting to create this multiverse of choices every night you go on stage. And you just I think you start refining both your voice and your taste.
Yeah.
What you're good at saying and what you like hearing other people say. And then you try to make the two meet where then you're doing the thing you like the most.
When you graduated, you knew that that's what you wanted to keep doing. You wanted to be involved in improv in some form or fashion.
Yeah. I actually had I had a regular job out of college, and it was for some other guys that I'd met at Northwestern who were older than me, and it was a tech startup, and I sort of sat at a desk all day thinking about improv. And I thought I was just, doing it inside my own head, but I guess it must have been visual to those I worked for. But I think about 2 months in, they came and they were really lovely guys, and they said, we love having you here. We're going to say something that we think you need to hear. You don't want to be doing this. And it was a really nice nudge towards what I did want to be doing. And so then I got a job waiting tables and started improvising as much as I could. And and then I got this opportunity to move overseas and do it as a full-time job.
This was for Boom Chicago. It's kind of confusing. It's called Boom Chicago, but it was based in Amsterdam.
Yes, it was Chicago guys who moved to Amsterdam and came to, with the aid of both their own ambition and legalized weed, came to the conclusion that an improv theater like Second City would work in Amsterdam because everybody spoke English and there was also a vibrant tourist community. And they tried to come up with a name where it meant the same in every language. So it was Boom Chicago, and it was, a sort of one of those old school Minesweeper bombs with a lit fuse. The problem is they did not realize that boom, which is how you pronounce boom in Dutch, means tree. So right off the bat, Tree Chicago does not sound like a fun improv theater, but there you go.
So you moved to Amsterdam for some time.
I did. Yeah, I moved April 1st, 1997. I went over there, and I was there for a couple of years, and then I went back a great deal. I felt the pull of it was very strong. I thought I maybe had made a mistake going back to Chicago, because you go back to Chicago and the way it should work, you kind of go to the back of the line amongst everybody who's been working and thriving in Chicago while you've been enjoying your time overseas. And, I felt like a very big fish in the Amsterdam comedy scene, which was comprised of exactly one theater. And then you come back and you're like, oh my God, look at all this talent. Maybe I should go back to Amsterdam. I know where all the good cafes are. This is, But yeah, I came home and again, going back to the same kind of luck I had at school, I had met this improviser named Jill Benjamin over at Boom Chicago, and it was her. She was the one who said, I don't want to go back and have nothing to do. So when we get back to Chicago, I think you and I should do a 2-person show. And that is what we started to do. We started to do this show in Chicago called Pickups and Hiccups. And that was sort of a very, lowercase b, big hit in Chicago. It wasn't, we had a nice little run where it was a show people were talking about. And I should note, like a 100-seat theater.
And you were like the straight man, right?
The straightest, yeah.
Yeah. And she was like kind of wild and just doing characters and that. And was that sort of one of the first times you kind of found that role really suited you to be that?
Yeah. I feel like in an equation, I'm a pretty good variable as a performer. Jill was a constant. She was always going to be the craziest, most inventive person on stage. So you could either go out and try to go toe-to-toe with her and lose every night, or you could provide this counterbalance. And the more we improvised together, the better I got at setting her up for things that would both surprise her, but then in her execution of it would delight the audience. And it was... I was so lucky. And the two of us just always had a blast on the stage. And we had no real overlap in which things we most wanted to be doing. And that went to the fact that I loved to write new sketches and she loved to figure out the best theater that we could do the show at and the best way to staff. And so she, we had these two sides of the brain that we kind of brought together and had a really just wonderful, wonderful run together.
So these were not improvised as much. It
was half and half. That show was sort of half and half, yeah.
And so how did you, going from doing improv work in Amsterdam, and presumably there was some writing, and obviously you're kind of architecting a sketch in your head even though it's improvised, right? But to sitting down and writing, we're talking about the late 90s, you're like in your 20s, and I remember being a writer for like the Washington City paper in the late 90s trying to write, and I look back at that stuff now, it's terrible, but you have to go through that period of like writing stuff that's bad in order to get good at it. What do you remember about like sitting in your apartment, coming up with ideas, figuring out what was going to work? Like, would you do it because today you obviously write with groups of people, but would you do it by yourself?
I would do it by myself. And even to this day, I do it by myself. I prefer writing alone. I've been lucky to be with incredible co-writers and collaborators over the years, but I think I'm most comfortable writing by myself. I love rewriting with other people. Yeah. Because I've been surrounded by the sort of talented writers who can always punch up your ideas.
Do you remember before you were asked to audition for SNL? Because that happened when you were like 25 or 26 probably.
Yeah.
And there's a period in life, and I think a lot of people experience this, which is like in your sort of early 20s before you know what's going to happen or what you're going to do with your life. And there's a lot of anxiety. And you were doing this stuff, but do you remember feeling like, where's this going to go?
It was very strange because living in Chicago at the time and feeling as though things were going okay. Pickups and Hiccups was well respected. And I was marking time in Chicago based on the fact that every 6 months or so, Second City would hold auditions. And that was, if I thought I was on a track at the time, it was, I'll come back and I will use everything I learned in Amsterdam and I will use the reputation I've built from this show and I will do Second City, and that will be, I will live in Chicago, do Second City, and then maybe one day that will lead to the next big thing. So I had anxiety about when those auditions would roll around for Second City, but in general, I was pretty content in those years. So I did feel very much like I had this path. I was like, all right, I'm aiming. I know what my North Star is, and my North Star is Second City, and I'm just going to keep my eyes on that prize.
And Saturday Night Live kind of came out of the blue, like it just somebody
jumped the line.
Yeah,
either you could say they jumped the line, or what I'm sure people in Chicago said at the time, I jumped the line.
I mean, that must have been
It was the craziest thing in the world. Jill Benjamin and I had got asked, I think it was the first or second Chicago Improv Festival, and they asked us to do a slot where we would perform Pickups and Hiccups. We were very excited. It was the biggest theater. we were ever performing in, and just that incredible dumb luck you need to succeed in this industry. This wonderful person named Ayala Cohen, who's now an agent but worked at SNL in the talent department. She was visiting family in Chicago, and she popped in just to check it out and saw us on stage, and that sort of started this, what ended up being over a year, but this process of, hey, send in an audition tape, and then, a year later, send in another audition tape, and then, 6 months after that, come in and audition. So it was amazing. And I always say to people, look, part of it, you can't decide what night the right person is going to see you, so do as many nights as possible, just increase your odds.
When we come back in just a moment, Seth ascends the ranks at 30 Rock and hosts a White House Correspondents' Dinner that has some unexpected outcomes. Stay with us. I'm Guy Raz, and you're listening to The Great Creators. Hey, welcome back to The Great Creators. Here's more from my conversation with Seth Meyers. You obviously got picked to go on to SNL, and you moved there in August of 2001, and obviously an auspicious time for New York City.
Yes.
But even like taking the leap from doing small theater in Chicago to going on a national and now international stage, which is SNL, I can't imagine how nerve-wracking that must have been, right? Because that is a huge leap. Like, all of a sudden, you are going to become a nationally known comedian.
Yes. It is, everything you said is true, including what an auspicious time it was. And the only thing I'll say is, when you do your first SNL a couple weeks after 9/11 in New York City, you realize no one else cares about what you're going through.
Yeah.
And it would have felt so big. And then in a way that was healthy and right, it felt manageable and small to figure out how to do sketch comedy in front of a live audience, considering what all of us had just been through. And then again, it is, look, there are things about SNL that are, it can be cutthroat, it can be competitive, it can be a place where self-doubt grows and is encouraged in a weird way. But when you actually get out on stage, you are surrounded by the most wonderful professionals at every stage: cameramen, cue cards, wardrobe, makeup, hair, and they all just sort of guide you in a way that makes you feel like you can do it.
Yeah.
And that like leads all the way up until the moment that you do it and the audience doesn't like it. Like, then it doesn't matter how good your costume is or how nice the set looks, but you feel so taken care of up to the moment that it's on you that there's really no excuses in that moment.
There's a video of Bill Hader being interviewed. I think it's for like a transcendental meditation conference, and he's talking about how freaked out he used to get before they go live, because apparently there's like a speaker, and it would say like 10 minutes before we go live, 5 minutes to national live, and he would get really nervous, and he would look at the other actors, and they were just hanging out and talking, and he would have this like incredible anxiety, which is amazing because you see him perform, and you can't see any of that. Do you remember feeling any of that, or how did you cope with whatever you had when you went out there? Because you got the cue cards, but still, like, you're just live.
I felt okay. My anxiety was always in between the shows. I was okay in the live shows. For me, it was the week between shows when I just felt like it wasn't going well. And
the writing.
It wasn't. I mean, I just, as a cast member, I think my writing was going fine. And it became very clear to me when people like Fred showed up, people like Keenan showed up, Will showed up. This is all after me. Jason, Bill, Andy. All of a sudden I saw, that's the trajectory it can look like. Because I sort of thought it happens slow, and then maybe in 6 or 7 years, but then, you're around these guys who are, not only, these really lovely people who are dear friends, but they're just immediately sort of lapping you in regards to what they're pulling off on stage every week. And so that to me was my anxiety, was just sort of sitting in my apartment thinking to myself, is this going to work? Am I? Because I don't know if I was, a detached observer and I had to make the choice of who to keep and who to let go. I don't know if I could really make an argument that this show needs Seth Meyers to keep going.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Fred Armisen and obviously Bill Hader and Jason Sudeikis, Andy Samberg. I mean, all these actors who were doing what you think a star member of the cast should be doing, which is great impressions, and they're funny. And so you're watching them and you are thinking, I'm not as good as them, and how can I be as good as them? Or maybe I won't. But obviously you leaned into something that you were really good at, which became a huge strength, which is, eventually what you would do. And a lot of it was writing for other characters.
Yeah.
How did you kind of discover that was really where you were going to shine as a star?
Well, it was what was working. If I wrote something for me, or if somebody else wrote something for me, it would go fine. But if I wrote a really great sketch and it was not dependent on actor Seth Meyers, they would just go better. And that was the thing. When I first started the show, I would resent that writers weren't writing more sketches for me. But then I became a writer on the show. And, I would all of a sudden be sitting down wondering, who am I going to give this best part to? And because my ego as a writer wanted the sketch to succeed, I would think to myself, well, I'm not going to let Seth Meyers fuck this up. I'll give it to Jason Sudeikis, or I'll give it to Bill Hader. And so then I had to go back and sort of unresent all the writers, because I just ultimately landed where they did, which is, you're going to bet on the horses that are, more likely to get the work done for you. So, but it was great. I also loved writing sketches, and I loved when sketches went well. But it also, the problem was, it wasn't my job. I wasn't hired to be a sketch writer on the show. I was hired to be a cast member.
Right.
And, basically, I really have, so much appreciation for Lorne seeing it as a path forward for me, because I wasn't a credited writer on the show. Cast members aren't. And then when Tina stepped away to go do 30 Rock, it was a very unconventional choice for Lorne, because he basically called me in and said, do you want to take over that role? Do you want to be? And to this day, I will say, I think the title in my bio that means the most, more than anything that I've ever done, is the fact that I was a head writer for the show show that taught me how to write.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, there are characters that you did that really, I think, worked so well. Like David Zinger, I think, is one of the best characters you did.
I think it is one of the only characters I did, but it is the best of them.
But it worked. I mean, it was like that dad joke kind of like cringy, like Ben Stiller kind of cringy character, and it's a great character. And so there were characters that you embodied and sort of clearly, like, you could make them your own.
Yes. I mean, the only problem is, another problem I had, Lauren used to say to me on Friday, you have to stop being a writer now. You get to be a writer for the first half of the week, and now you have to be a performer, and you have to get loose, and you have to... Yeah. People do want to see cast members have fun in sketches. SNL is a place where, yes, everybody who's watching it knows it's live, but they don't want to watch people look scared or tight or, like it's life or death, because it's not. Certainly not for people who are, watching TV at midnight. It's supposed to be the end of the week. And so I also had a stage manager who, my first 4 years on the show, if I wrote a sketch, I would say my line, and then when the other person was talking, I would mouth their line. So that's not something they teach you in drama school. Just remember. So say your lines out loud, and then say everybody else's quietly.
Yeah. When you really kind of leaned into and became the head writer, I mean, it's a different kind of pressure, right? Because that show is so like judged. It's so under the microscope. You can go online and find a million best of SNL years, the worst years, the most disastrous. I think like 94 to 95 or something is like the worst. Consistently
not reflected on fondly. Yes.
So did you feel like, how did you cope with that kind of pressure? Because earlier you talked about the middle of the week was hard for you, especially early on when you were like, this character that I'm trying to be is not working. But now you're writing, you're overseeing writers, so it's a different kind of pressure. And what did you face then?
I have to say, the premise of your question is correct, but it wasn't my experience. I was so relieved to finally have a role that fit my skills.
Yeah.
That relief was so much more palpable than any extra pressure I felt. I all of a sudden knew where I was. I felt my feet on the ground. And then the other thing is, again, if there's a theme to this conversation, it's how lucky I was to be with the people I was with.
Yeah.
I was there. It was an exceptional cast in their ascendancy. The show is never better when the audience is falling in love with a cast. Eventually, they fall out of love with the cast, but that moment was a really cool thing to be a part of. We had a A-list writer's room. Everybody liked each other. And so I got the gig at the perfect time. I'd like to think I played a role and what a good time that was at the show, but I also think anybody who was head writer at that time would have sort of ridden that wave because it was the best. I mean, you know, all those people I mentioned earlier, but then you also had Maya and Amy, and then Kristen Wiig was a new cast member, and you had a writing staff that included people like Simon Rich and, you know, John Mulaney and Paula Pell. And so it was nuts, and everybody was trying new things, and you had the dawn of the digital short era. You had a really good political year in 2008.
Yeah.
And when the smoke cleared, more people were watching the show, and I think they kind of found out they liked the people they were seeing. And so it was the best. And it should be noted, it was also a time where the conventional wisdom wasn't this show used to be better. Like we were very aware that we had sort of there was like a 3 to 5 year run. It felt like a time where everybody thought it was fun, including there was a run of, you know, people hosting for the first time who then became hosts over and over again, like Emma Stone and Scarlett Johansson and Jonah Hill and Seth Rogen. And so it's just a really cool time where the show felt like culturally relevant and everybody was having a good time.
I mean, talk about cultural relevance. Like, I think many people, maybe the majority of people, believe that Sarah Palin really did say, "I can see Russia from my house," but she actually she never actually said that. You wrote that line for Tina Fey.
I did. So here's it's heartbreaking, but never let him say I'm not an honest man. I wrote that sketch, and Mike Shoemaker, the aforementioned Mike Shoemaker, we were sitting there doing rewrites, and he just said from across the room, "I can see Russia from my house," and I was like, "Son of a gun. I'm going to put it in, and my name's going to be on the sketch," but that's going to be the line that always gets quoted back. But it was, you know, and that was a trip for us because people also forget that Tina had left the show. And, you know, not only was, you know, running and starring in 30 Rock, but had a family of her own and was still, I don't know, it was like getting called up from the reserves. You know, she had to come
every week.
Yeah, she did 6, and we had to keep beating it every time. And it was really special.
What did you see I mean, I have a perspective on this. I'm curious about yours, like your role as the host of Weekend Update, because I think like if you were to point like your more cowbell sketch or like the sketch people remember you most for, it would be Stefan coming, like Bill Hader, Stefan coming on next to you.
That's what I get asked about the most. Yeah.
Right. And so your role was to kind of help this character or just elevate this character. And I mean, did you see that? I mean, you were obviously playing the straight man as the news anchor.
Yes.
Is that how you saw what you were supposed to do in, you know, sitting behind that desk?
It certainly harkened back to my days of a straight man doing a sketch show in Chicago. The thing that I'm happiest I did as a fake news anchor, is I always had affection and patience for the guests. Historically, the game is always whatever you introduce people to come on and do, they're immediately going to stop doing.
Right.
And so there's a couple ways you can play it. And one, which I think would have been my instinct when I first started on the show, would be rage and frustration and getting angry. But by the time those years rolled around, I thought, you know what? I'm having a good time.
Yeah.
The audience is having a good time. Stefan is great company. And why do I have to sit here and pretend like I'm frustrated? And people always say to me, how could you not break during Stefan? And my take is always, I'm pretty sure I am breaking. I think I'm.
And he was too sometimes. I mean,
he was too. But, I think maybe it's just that I broke less than Bill. And so they're like, how'd you do it? But I'm always so happy when I see, because again, obviously, it's a little bit like doing Stefan with Bill is a little bit like being anybody on a Michael Jordan Bulls team. Yes, I got a ring, but I think we all know who won it. But I'm so happy when I see a two-shot of me and any update guest where I'm smiling. It makes me really happy because I was really happy. I loved that desk so much. I loved being out there with Amy. And then when Amy left, it was really important to me to turn Update into a place that was me and this rotating cast of plus ones. And, Bobby Moynihan and Kate McKinnon and Keenan. I mean, those are some of my happiest times, was just feeling like I was an audience member with the closest seat.
I mentioned this to you before we started recording, but I was, back in the day, I was a host of All Things Considered at NPR, and I was at the 2011 White House Correspondents' Dinner where you were the host of it, and you gave a really, really funny speech, and President Obama did too. But we now, of course, remember that night, and I know you've been asked about this a lot and have had sort of time to reflect on it, but many people remember that night as an evening when Donald Trump was really humiliated publicly for and it's comedy and it's a roast, and every politician gets humiliated. And Donald Trump happens to be somebody who just doesn't really have a great sense of humor. He cannot laugh about himself. But there was some really, it was rough. I mean, your famous joke, like I thought, he says he's going to run as a Republican. I thought he was running as a joke. Did you? I mean, when you look back on that evening, I mean, do you think that is there any plausibility in your view that it created some kind of rage in him that stayed with him that would somehow motivate, I don't know, a sense of revenge, or I want to, because it's a room filled with reporters and Hollywood actors and the sort of the Hollywood and media elite kind of laughing at this guy and others. And I don't know, do you think there's any truth to that?
Well, I don't think he has any trouble coming up with rage. I think he can generate it internally pretty easily. But I do think there's some truth to being in that room. I do think that he considered, he forgot that you can't be everything all at once. You know, you can't be a right-wing politician and also a member of New York high society and a person who gets to be in on the joke hosting SNL at the same time behaving the way someone does when they become a target of SNL. So I do think his eyes were maybe open to the way he was being perceived. The thing I always, want to remind people, because, it wasn't just this ad hominem attack on him. It was really in the middle of when he was being very racist about President Obama's birth certificate. And the birtherism, it shamefully feels a little quaint now, but it was, awful at the time. And so I have no regret. I mean, certainly the outcome post that evening is not what I expected it would be. But I have no regret about the jokes. The thing I always want to make clear is when I don't ever, because I do pull jokes when I think they're too harsh or undeserved. And I don't think there was a single one that evening that I have any regret about.
I mean, traditionally, right, like people in your role, talk show hosts or, people sort of in the public eye would be very careful about talking about their political views. And you've been upfront, like your views are what they are, and you feel like that's part of what you should also be putting out there. Yeah.
I mean, again, came up at a time when talk show hosts, it was a little bit murky as to exactly where they stood.
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden you have The Daily Show, right? And you have Jon Stewart, and you have everything comes off of Jon Stewart, and you realize, one, it's fun to watch. I like knowing what the host thinks.
Yeah.
And then there is this era that I think we're still living through of authenticity and comedy. I don't think people dig a comedian who their truth is just the funniest punchline. And
Yeah.
over the course of an hour, you see them end up on a lot of different sort of contradicting positions for the benefit of the laugh. And so, people will say, aren't you worried about alienating half your audience? I don't think they're half my audience. I don't think they ever were. And the audience I have shows up every night with an expectation of who I am. And so the last thing I would want to do, because it is who I am, is try to pretend to be someone else.
When you were given the opportunity to take over late night, when Jimmy Fallon left that show to host the Tonight Show, there are versions of what you were doing, many things that you had been doing on SNL, writing and hosting Weekend Update, but this was now your show. And from what I've read about the beginning, it was for you like a kind of a difficult start. Like at the beginning, it wasn't quite working. What was going on?
We aimed for competence first, and that isn't great television, And I don't know if it was the wrong call, but looking back is the mistake was let's just prove we can do a talk show.
Yeah.
And then in time, we'll do a good talk show. And then eventually we'll do our good talk show. And I think everybody has to take those steps. It's just, these shows work well. And why I really love doing the show now and why I think it's the best version of the show now is we spend a ton of time in the writing, but the show always feels spontaneous. And I feel perfectly welcome by both the audience and our staff to take wild tangents off script if something happens, and to live in the moment. And the audience likes knowing that it's really happening. And I like talking about what I'm feeling when a joke doesn't work. And those are all things that maybe I would have come off as a little cocky if you started doing them in the first show. So maybe it was the right path, but man, oh man, it's a lot nicer to be where we are now than where we were in the beginning. And even just like, starting with a monologue where I was standing because I thought that's what late night talk shows do.
Yeah, you used to stand up, right, at the beginning. Yeah. And then eventually you went to sit down behind the desk.
Yeah. It was funny because a lot of people said, have you thought about sitting at the desk to start? And I took offense at it. I thought, I'm going to show you. I'm going to do the best standing monologue. And then all of a sudden, after I'd said, how dare you to every person I knew, I pretended like it was my idea and said, you know what? I'm going to sit at the desk. And it made a huge difference. Comfort. It's really important in these shows if you're going to do them all week long. People, they're watching your show. It's 12:30 at night on a weeknight. They want comfort. And I'm really comfortable doing it now. Not to the point where it's easier to put the work in, but it's just easier. The hour doing the show is easier because I figured out what we're aiming for. In the beginning, I feel like we were just practicing shooting arrows, but we didn't know where the target was.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like we had perfect arrow form, but then someday somebody turned on the lights and was like, just so you know, your show should be aiming over here. And I was like, okay.
When we come back in just a moment, Seth tells us how his late night show redefined its voice with the hit segment A Closer Look, and what it was like to produce the mockumentary series Documentary Now with his former SNL cast members. Stay with us. I'm Guy Raz, and you're listening to The Great Creators. Hey, welcome back to The Great Creators. I'm Guy Raz. Here's more from my conversation with Seth Meyers. The whole concept of a late night show or any talk show, daytime talk show, is challenging, right? Because there are many of them. And so when you were, not just when you started it, but when you were kind of evolving it, and even today, how did you and how do you think about, or maybe not, how to differentiate the show? Or maybe it's not that important because obviously the guests that you're interviewing are going to be in other shows. I've had them on this show. And, like they've been asked the same questions. You've been asked the same questions. How do you think about drawing people out? I mean, some shows rely on games, and those games can be really fun and funny and viral, but sometimes it's not the right fit for the show, right? Sometimes there are really hard guests like Kanye West, or you just had Woody Harrelson on, obviously he's amazing, but he's challenging in other ways. A lot of ideas in that question, but how do you think about all those things?
Well, one thing, again, it's a little bit easier for us versus you in that shorter interview, right? So
Yeah.
ultimately, I try to get away without asking the same questions that someone has been asked on their current press tour. You try to avoid anything like that. And, I'm relying on an incredible research team and segment producers who are sort of
Yeah.
steering me to, sort of fresh snow. And that's an important part of it. And then the other thing is if you just stick with your sense of humor, we found our way into this segment Closer Look, which is anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And it's the lion's share of the written comedy we do in the show. And it's basically our head writer, Sal Gentile, the head writer of A Closer Look, and then Alex Bays, our head writer, and myself. And so it's the three of us, and it's our tastes, and it's the sort of jokes we like telling. And the longer we've done it, even though we're talking about the same things that our fellow hosts are talking about often,
Yeah.
the sense of humor is our own. And that's not to say it's better or worse than anybody else, but certainly through the pandemic, where we really embraced being as unique to what made us laugh as we had ever been before. Coming out of the pandemic and being back in the studio, I never think, oh, somebody else is going to do this. I just don't think it's feasible in the way that it might have been early on.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that segment, A Closer Look, because I think oftentimes it's 12 minutes or even longer. And you remember, like Jon Stewart used to say, like when he would be asked about his show, which became a source of news for a lot of people for a long time, he would say, I'm not a journalist, I'm a comedian. And while I understood that, part of me as a former journalist was really bothered by that because I thought that he was, in a sense, kind of like he needed to also own that too, in a good way, that was part of his responsibility. In your case with The Closer Look, like, it's not always funny, and it doesn't, like, I mean, you talked a lot about Trump, and you really famously went after him. I mean, you called him a racist and a liar and all these things. And so I wonder, I mean, when you think about that segment, do you think about it as pure comedy, or do you think of it as just an opportunity to talk about the absurdities of what's going on in the world?
Sal framed it great once where he said, A Closer Look is written by and for the formerly sane. And that is what we feel about it, which is, It used to be, when we started, I think, look, you're not crazy, the world is crazy. And now it's, look, the world is crazy, and because of that, we're all crazy.
Yeah.
And so there is a catharsis to writing it and to performing it, and we do think that there's a catharsis to watching it. Obviously, it is about the day's news. I think that even though I would be a little loath to call myself a journalist as well, mostly just because I don't feel like I have that training, whatnot. But I do think we approach it with the kind of integrity you would hope for from journalism. We really fact check it all. If we're going to call somebody racist, we try to give 3 good examples of them being racist so that, we don't expect people to go off and check whether or not there's any, supporting evidence for that. And then, we just try to pile in as many jokes as possible because, when it's awful stuff, you do want to have a way to release the pressure from it.
Yeah.
And we can't believe it's become what it was. We started doing it. We had no expectation that it would become the sort of heart of the show, but we're really happy it became the heart of the show. And it also, it's very written, but it does feel like more than other shows. It feels like you're improvising because I don't know now what tomorrow's Closer Look's going to be about.
Yeah.
And Sal probably doesn't either.
Yeah.
And so, that lets you kind of live your life and wait for it to hit you, as opposed to let's sit down now and start writing, knowing that with the way our world moves today, we're going to have to rip it up in 4 hours anyway. So you try to wait until you see the whites of the eyes of the next day's news before you get started.
I mean, it's like writing a sketch show every day. Not like, it is. Like, it reminds me of actors who say, like, they really learn their craft by doing daytime soaps. Because you are memorizing a script 5 days a week, and you are filming. And, like, you are writing 30, 40 minutes of copy every day. Your teammates.
Yes. We don't have in a way that makes our life a little easier. We don't have a massive sketch element to the show anymore. It's a lot of man at desk looking at camera. So at least we don't have to do a lot of rehearsals for blocking. But, you know, it's not just us and our director and the booth. I mean, our graphics, the amount of things we ask our incredibly talented graphics team to do, the dumbest things. And here are these people who, you know, went to art school and have this training, and you're basically saying, hey, can you make it look like a Spirit airplane is close enough to a United airplane to steal its Wi-Fi? And they must just think, son of a bitch. I went to school for this.
How do you, I mean, there have been moments where you're just feeling like you're not funny. And when you do have those moments or periods where you're not writing funny things, what do you do to kind of shake out of it?
Well, the gift of this schedule is you write the next day. There is no time.
Yeah.
Whereas SNL was a lot harder. You have 3 bad weeks in a row on SNL, and now it's a hiatus week. And Lauren used to famously say, as a joke, I should stress, but it hit home, before the last show of the season, he would give some version of a speech where he'd say, you know, you're going to go home for the summer and see your friends and family, and they'll comment on the last show, and it's going to be really hard if it's a bad one. And so I think that's very inspirational.
Yeah.
But yeah, now it just moves too fast. And so I can say that I don't feel like we've had 3 bad shows in a row in a recent stretch of time. And so that makes it easy. We just kind of charge ahead.
I mean, obviously, like the things that are funny to you or matter to you now are very different than when you were in your 20s, right? You've got kids, and you're, you know, a middle-aged man like I am, and you know, you've got like other things that you're thinking about in life. And so, what do you? I don't know. It's kind of an abstract question, but where do you sort of look around for to kind of hone your craft? And I mean, you've mastered what you do. You've written thousands and thousands of hours of jokes, but still, like, you want to get better at what you do. You want to be better at it in 5 years.
It's funny, you know, all you want to see is, it doesn't have to be the things you're thinking about, but when someone has refined their voice in a way that impresses you, that's just a reminder to work harder on refining yours. You know, I just watched Nate Bargatze's last special, and I'm just in awe of how consistent he is and how funny it is without any that I can see bells and whistles or tricks or shortcuts. And then, you know, every now and then you just, you know, you see a show like Fleabag or Catastrophe we just rewatched, and or, you know, White Lotus, where you realize, oh, look at how unique this voice is, and look at how they're writing a thing that nobody else could write.
Yeah.
And so that inspires you. You know, I think that once you reach, you know, middle age as a comedian or a person, it's probably too late to be a different person, but it's not too late to be the best version that you've sort of committed to. Yeah. And so that, when, you know, again, so you can be a young comic. You know, Tim Robinson is a comedian who was on SNL, who now has this show, I Think You Should Leave, with Zach Cannon. You know, they were young writers when I was the head writer at SNL, and now I find them inspiring because it's just so purely them. So that's what you look for, and that's how it's just, you know, you never want to be complacent. I think that the hardest thing about doing a talk show like this is the repetition, not letting the repetition force you into a place of complacency. And so, you know, you just keep your eye on that. And then you watch stuff where you just so jealous at how good it is that it makes you work a little bit harder.
Are you competitive?
I was very competitive. I would say the most competitive period of my life was those years at SNL. And then once I kind of found that home of head writer and Weekend Update, I became less competitive. And I've tried to maintain that because my life is a lot better without that. Because you realize, like, if you can get to the same destination from being inspired by the people around you as opposed to being competitive with them, they will enjoy your company more.
I know, I mean, just my impression is that there's a lot of friendly collegiality between the sort of the prominent hosts of late night shows, you know, Jimmy Fallon and Kimmel and you and James Corden and Stephen Colbert. Stephen Colbert's been on the show. And I imagine the ones you know and you like and are friendly with. But I wonder, is there, I mean, do you feel any competitive, I don't know, do you watch what they do and think, oh, I wish we could do that, or they're doing that better? I don't know.
I will say I tend to see their best things because I don't, have a schedule to sit down and watch them. And so you sometimes have to remind yourself that you're seeing their best things because as you watch it, like, son of a gun, that's really good. And then, but I hopefully that's true when they see our best things as well. But I don't, I think these things only work if you do your version. And so, or Taylor's version, that seems to have worked very well. I think if Taylor did Taylor's version of the show, I think we could all agree more people would watch it and it would be more popular. But so I don't find myself checking in a way that would make me jealous. It goes back to the same thing of everybody, I've been lucky enough to, only lucky because I'm a fan of James Corden. It's been really nice I think it's going to be 8 years when he wraps up his show. And, everything he's great at would be an abject disaster if I tried to do it. So it was lovely to sort of watch 8 years of him doing really fantastic things that only an accomplished and gifted performer could get away with. And it brought me back to, my SNL days of thinking, well, you can be jealous that Andy Samberg is, the world's foremost comedy rapper, while also knowing it would not be a good look if you did it. So I'm happy to know that my colleagues are always going to be able to execute things that my skill set is incapable of doing.
In terms of this idea of getting complacent, how important is it that you are also working on other things at the same time? You've written a kid's book, which is a great book, and my kids are too old for it now, but it's a lovely book. But also Documentary Now, which I know, I mean, anyone who's seen it and is just blown away by it because they are, sometimes you watch them, and for people who don't know what it is, it's basically parodies of documentaries, famous documentaries like D.A. Pennebaker and the Thin Blue Line, and sometimes you watch them and I'm like, is this a joke? Like, they're so good, they're so funny, and you are one of the creators of this series. Before I ask you about it, is that one of the things that you have to do to stay stimulated?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have to do it, but I love it so much. It's a very funny thing that it exists because it's hard to argue that there was a demand for this hyper-specific documentary parody show. And yet, got to create it with Bill and Fred and Rhys Thomas and Alex Buono, these incredible directors who we all worked with at SNL and John Mulaney. So it was this chance for us to continue this working relationship that, because of the fact that we all splintered away from SNL on our own time, it allowed us to get back together again, and it allowed us to make a much slower paced, longer form sketch comedy show that hopefully, the one thing about Documentary Now, it might not get the ratings, but you could watch one in 30 years and it will be exactly as topical as it is today.
It's an amazing show. I mean, you have Helen Mirren as the host of it, and it looks like a PBS documentary opening. And then, I mean, I'm just going to point out some of the ones that you did. Like, you did one which was a documentary about a town in Iceland that with earnest gusto celebrates Al Capone Day. In this, and I've been to Iceland, and obviously I think you must have filmed it there.
100%.
It was 100%. So funny. How did you even come up with that concept?
Well, that is the most Fred Armisen of ideas. Fred had this idea because Fred had noticed in his travels in Europe that every now and then in Europe there'll be like an Al Capone themed hamburger restaurant. What they think is American, or it'll be Chicago blues pizza, weird sort of combinations of American culture.
Right.
And so he had this idea for an Al Capone Day, and it's, a couple, Fred and Aidy Bryant, and then I think the entire cast is Icelandic. They're wonderful, just terrific actors. And it's been such a cool thing to do. And then the other great thing about the longer we do it, the more people see it and are game to do episodes. And all of a sudden, Kate Blanchett does an episode and then suggests an episode.
Blanchett basically portrayed Marina Abramovich, the performance artist. It was amazing.
I'm a big fan of Tar. Don't get me wrong. I don't know if she's had a better performance. It's
amazing.
Unbelievable.
When you're the credited head writer on an episode, are you on location too?
Not once. I mean, part of it is just the schedule.
You got 3 kids.
I got 3 kids. Yeah, it's mostly just saying to your wife, "Hey, I got to go to Cardiff. I got to be there to make sure the rocks look right." But that, I will say this: it all goes back to the creation of the show was predicated on the fact that we all had this shorthand and trust. None of us would have time for a show like this. And so when Reese and Alex go off to shoot them, it's so exciting because I'm certain it will come back better than what I expected it would be. And nothing is more exciting than when you get the first cut of one of these episodes.
I bet. You've committed to doing late night through 2025. At least, and maybe, we'll see what happens then. But you've got a production company with Mike Shoemaker, right?
Yes.
It's called
Seth Meyers. People hate it, the name, but we really like it. They hate it because they're like, we get it. You guys are best friends. Oh, my God. What a dumb name.
What do you sort of, when you look out like 10 years from now, can you see a world where you are doing late night and making, sort of producing television and film, or maybe not doing like that? I don't know. What can you imagine?
I am not bored of it yet. I don't know if I can look 10 years in the future, but if I looked 5, I would like to still be doing this show. I would like to still be doing stand-up somewhere. I still love doing that. And when this show runs its course, I would be, the thing I want to do that I feel like I haven't done yet is, write more things. I like having a production company because we try really hard to give opportunity to the friends and coworkers that we delight in and want more people to see. But I don't get the same rush off producing that I do off writing. And so I think in the end, like my plan is to just at some point fall back to the thing I've always identified with most, which is writing. And I should note the thing that old people do the best, a lot of great old writers out there. So I think, if I was like, I think maybe basketball is my next act, I think we'd all be a little bit less enthusiastic for it.
If there was one thing that you would now do differently about the way you thought of your career or sort of engaged in your career earlier on, knowing what you know now and what you do now, what would you have changed?
Here's the thing. I feel like I'm so happy with where it has landed in this present moment that I wouldn't want to change much. I certainly wish I'd been less competitive. I wish I'd been less jealous of the people I loved, but I'm also lucky enough that I internalized that jealousy in a way that it didn't poison those friendships. And I've been very honest with people that I'm close to now about the shame I feel about being angry at their success. And, I wouldn't want to go back and tell my younger self, look, it's all going to work out. Right. You don't have to feel anxiety, because I don't think it would then work out. Right. So, it's crazy, man. I've worked in the same building for over 20 years. I have the same ID that I took when August 20th, 2001. But I look the same. It's really shocking. Absolutely just unchanged. And yet I'm so happy. 30 Rock is a building that it means there's few buildings in the world that sort of stand for show business like this. And so here we are.
Seth Meyers, thanks so much.
This was just lovely.
That's Seth Meyers. You can find links to clips from Seth's career at thegreatcreators.com/Myers, including a compilation of him doing his absolute best not to burst into laughter next to Bill Hader's Stefan on Saturday Night Live. And you can find all of our previous episodes of The Great Creators at thegreatcreators.com. Thanks so much for listening to our show this week, and be sure to click the follow button at the top of your podcast app so you don't miss any new episodes. This episode was produced by Nat Hoops and edited by Jeff Rogers. Thanks also to Kevin Leahy, Elaine Coates, Kayla Rosenbaum, Jenna Gedman, Michael May, and Daniel Shukin. I'm Guy Raz, and you've been listening to The Great Creators from Built It Productions.